one, go. Careful. What are you doing? Are you okay?
Hello and welcome to the Power Drifting Podcast bonus stage. I am your host this time, that's Martin with a T. And on this episode, I'll be looking at a game from the year of rendered graphics, 1994. And it's Power Drive, with the Super Nintendo version being the main feature. So what do I mean by the year of rendered graphics? Well, around 1994 we saw a big rise in rendered visuals. So that's games with graphics created on high-end workstations such as Silicon Graphics and then hugely and quite impressively compressed to fit onto tiny cartridges. And this made the sprites look kind of realistic. Big examples of the year are mega hit Donkey Kong Country and fighting game Killer Instinct, which both were developed in the UK by Rare, much like Power Drive has been developed in the UK as well. And both, of course, were huge hits, with Donkey Kong Country in particular boasting some very impressive 32-bit style graphics. But before we step into Power Drive, let's have a look at 1994 in news. So that saw the official opening of the Channel Tunnel, and that's a tunnel that runs between the UK and France. Also, the National Lottery in the UK was launched, which is something that I still have not managed to win. TV mega hit Friends also came out in 1994, and it's the show that keeps on giving now that McDonald's have announced a series of toys based around the series. Now, I'm a huge fan of Friends, but I'm not really sure who they're aiming that at, so there we go. Finally, Nelson Mandela became the first black president of South Africa, which is a massive event, almost as big as the launch of Friends, I'm sure we all agree. But we're not here to talk about any of that. We're here to talk about Power Drive, so let's crack on. Power Drive then, which is not to be confused with the Sega classic Power Drift, is a 1994 top-down rally racer developed by Raid Software in the UK. It was released for the SNES, which is the primary version featured here, and of course the Mega Drive, Amiga with a CD32 version as well, plus the PC via DOS, and later on the Game Gear. The SNES version was released in 1994 November, with the remaining versions coming out in December, and the Game Gear version arriving later in June of 1995. Rage Software themselves, based in the UK, have a somewhat eclectic catalogue of games, starting from the Striker football series, which is quite a poor series, although it does have quite a lot of popularity, although Striker 96 is really good, but on the whole it was just a bit too fast and a bit crazy. They also did Dark Light Conflict, which is a pretty interesting early space shooter on the PlayStation, and Wild Wild Racing. It's the greyest of the PS2 launch lineups, but it does actually play a pretty decent off-road racer. And I think it's something of an underrated gem. Given that it's off-road, it could be classed as a rally game, although we don't really hold the rules that tight here, so you may well see it on here at a later date. But if you haven't checked out Wild Wild Racing, I definitely recommend you have a look. And back to Power Drive. So I'm not looking to cover each version in detail. The focus will be on the Super Nintendo version. But all home versions, in my experience, are fairly similar in terms of gameplay and content. So don't worry too much if you don't have the Super Nintendo version or you don't have a way to play it. As I mentioned, Power Drive is a top-down rally game, which is something that wasn't that common at the time, certainly on the home consoles and certainly on the Super Nintendo. It contains a number of cars, 6 to be clear, and they're presented in pairs over the course of a single core game mode, a season or championship mode if you like. And you start by entering your name on a somewhat dramatic opening screen, and then you're asked to choose between a cute pair of cars, which are the Fiat Cinquecento and an old school Mini, complete with its bonnet stripes. And once done, you start a career of sorts that takes you to 8 locations around the world. And as you progress through the seasons, you gain access to faster cars. The second pair in this case is a Ford RS Cosworth, an Escort RS Cosworth, complete with the fantastically huge whale tail spoiler, and a Renault Clio. But sadly, the Renault does not have any sign of the delectable Nicole of the era. The game speeds up with each pair, as you can probably imagine. It's already a sizable challenge, and it leads to the final pair of cars, the Vauxhall Astra and the now legendary Toyota Celica. Now, it's not the Sega Rally Toyota Celica that was famous for being in Sega Rally and being banned from the WRC for a pretty clever turbo modification. It was the Toyota Celica that actually won the WRC and was not banned from the competition with the pop-up headlights, the generation before, the Gen 5 it is. So fantastic car, and it's the best car in the game. Each season within the game comes with a variety of events. You can rally, which is effectively a time trial against the clock with a qualifying time to aim for. If you hit this time, you'll qualify for the next event. You also have a one-on-one race, which contains a number of laps with the aim to complete in the qualifying time. And if you win, you get nice cash bonuses. But you do not need to win to progress through, which is quite a novel thing for 1994. There's also the fantastic slash infuriating Gymkhana events. Now, being a mid-90s British game, this is not the Ken Block Gymkhana that we've come to know. It's quite a serious, quite a po-faced drive around an obstacle course in effect. So you have a few challenges, drive through the cones, around in a circle, bit of reverse parking, because who doesn't want that in a video game? Emergency stopping, and you need to complete all this within the time limit. Now, these are really tough. Hitting a cone in any of these can give you a huge time penalty, but weaving through them is even more difficult. Complete failure often means if you hit the cone, it's game over because the cone gets stuck under your wheels, gets dragged along, and your time penalty goes through the roof. But they're also really satisfying to complete. So it's one of those where they're an interesting inclusion. There's not too many of them, so they don't bog the game down. But it was a nice idea for the time. So Rage Software, in their infinite wisdom, have attempted to make Power Drive quite realistic. The handling certainly takes some getting used to, and cars can initially feel quite unwieldy. As the wheels turn, you need to wait for them to recenter, which gives the car a little bit of swing, and it can make the game feel a little bit laggy. And you'll need to learn the limits of the cars in order to corner precisely. This is certainly possible, but it does take quite a bit of patience and a fair amount of skill. And does it work? I think so, but you simply cannot drive full blast in Power Drive unless you master the game. Something that, to be fair, I haven't even done myself. But subtle use of the turning, combined with the shoulder buttons, helps master the cars. But it's never easy, and they have a tendency to swing into a turn, and the early cars especially do feel very front-wheel drive, which is quite impressive when you think about it. They've simulated that feel. You can feel the nose of the car dragging you around the track, almost kicking and screaming as you narrowly avoid another time-sucking cone and probably miss a cash pickup. And yet, there are a few pickups on the track too, so cash being one of them, a nitro boost being another, usually on the straights, and you need to make sure you're completely lined up before you hit one, otherwise you'll be crashing off the side. There's a time stop item as well, and all are vital in order to beat the best times, because if you beat the best times of the track, you get a further cash boost. So what's all this cash for? Well, buying a car is one of them. You cannot buy a new car until the time is right, but you'll need the cash for it as well. But also, each race has a fee, so again, you need cash to enter. But most importantly, you need cash for damage. The cars do take damage, although it's not visual, but it can get very expensive to repair. But the game is structured in a way that steady racing does reward success. You won't necessarily need to master it, but if you can be consistent, you can certainly get through and complete it. onto the graphics. Now, I've mentioned that they come from that pre-rendered era that was 1994. As we know, Rare were certainly some of the early pioneers in pre-rendered graphics, SGI workstations, etc., compressing them down to fit onto 16-bit games. And Rage appeared to do the same or similar with the cars of Power Drive. Now, each one has tons of animation frames, which might seem odd for a car with so few moving parts, but of course, it allows them to rotate incredibly smoothly. And you'll also see the wheels turning, which was quite novel at the time as well. Even the first Ridge Racer didn't show this. And the cars vibrate nicely on the surfaces and as they're accelerating, which does give a pretty cool effect. Each car has a couple of colours as well that are clearly not manufacturer spec, but nice that you can change the colour of your car. They do have a somewhat matte finish. You can't really expect shines. There's no ray tracing on these games, but they do look pretty good on screen across all versions. I think the Super Nintendo version does look the best in this era, certainly with the car sprites, I mean, but they're all decent. The cars look like they're real life models, and yeah, level of detail is certainly decent there. Background detail as well was pretty solid, with the 8 locations ranging from the wet Britain to the snowy Scandinavia of Sweden. The latter as well being a real challenge. So it's nothing spectacular in terms of graphics, but it all works smoothly. The night racers are present, which you have two amusing sort of glowing blobs as your headlights. Now, if you damage these, I mentioned that there's damage, and the damage doesn't actually impact the car, but it does impact the lights, and they will start to flicker and eventually go out, which is a pretty cool little touch. You've got a few smoke effects here and there, rain and fog, so each location is presented just like their real life counterparts. So do expect to be sliding around the snow of Sweden or struggling for visibility in the UK. Rage did a decent job, I'd say, of creating various locations, which make them feel different in terms of looks and design and also in gameplay. So it does impact the gameplay to a certain extent as well. So credit to them for doing that really well. An interesting choice on the Super Nintendo version is the use of the high resolution mode for the intro screens and the post race repair screen. It was my first memory of this sort of flickery, interlaced high res graphics that became commonplace on the PS2 Dreamcast era. And it does look pretty good on a CRT, but it can look a little strange on emulators. But I do remember it at the time being pretty cool. Audio wise, on the Super Nintendo version, it's pretty good. Some chunky tunes play pleasantly in the background, and the engine noises sound fine without being spectacular or annoying. It all works pretty well. Interestingly, though, and surprisingly, the Mega Drive version only allows for sound effects or music, which is a bit of a shame, as the rest of the game is great on the Mega Drive, and it even has a few additional scenery aspects such as bridges, which are not on the Super Nintendo version. But as a whole, it's a fairly solid package without ever being spectacular. Rage, though, clearly did put a lot of love and care into the game. It has smart intermission screens that contain a real 1970s Ford Escort. They're scattered throughout the game. And if you leave it to demo, you'll see that the team took part in a forest rally experience. Now, I presume this was to get a feel for the sport as they attempted to simulate it for the home. Now, as a whole, I think Rage pulled up a fairly decent game here. It's one of my actual personal favourites. So, subjectively, I love it. Objectively, I think it's pretty decent. And I'd recommend to anyone that likes a challenging top down racer to check it out. Critics of the time were fairly impressed by it, with total scoring it around 8. Well, they scored it 80%. And they called it a strange mixture of frustration, repetition, and addiction, which I think is kind of on point. It's an exciting and hefty challenge, if a flawed challenge, they said. So I personally kind of agree with that. It's a decent game. I love it myself, but it's a decent game and it does have a few issues. Superplay were a little bit less kind though. They scored it 69%. They called it old hat and quoted some nonsense about how Micro Machines is just better. Now, Micro Machines was immensely popular. Personally, I find it quite dull, although it does have a really good multiplayer mode, but the single player racing is pretty dull in it. Nintendo Magazine, though, magazine system did weigh in with a very tasty 90%, but for me that is a touch generous. Although I won't lie to you, I didn't bother looking up the review because, needs must. Time is of the essence. So regardless, Power Drive offers a unique experience for the time, a rally simulation in its top-down perspective, which is pretty unusual, like I said, on the consoles and particularly on the Super Nintendo. It's a gritty, grueling, and satisfying game, even if it can be pretty tricky to get into. It's well worth a look, though, if you do enjoy this type of game. So, by all means, check it out in any way you can, and let us know how you've got on if you have tried it for the first time by checking out our Facebook pages or our other social media pages. So, thanks for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this race into the past, and I'll hope to speak to you again soon.
Finish!